AMD's done more than refresh their latest APU. The A10-7860K has a reduced TDP down to 65 watts, an impressive 30-watt reduction over other current AMD APUs, which sit around 95 watts. And this seems to be a trend with AMD lately. Their Fiji cards, for instance, and the 300 series cards both made moves to change the thermal package of the die to reduce its TDP, reduce its overall heat output. And this is a response from AMD to criticism from reviewers and users alike with regard to power and thermal output of their devices. So the A10-7860K is what we are reviewing today. This is the new APU. It's a $120 unit, and we're going to be looking at that. The new A10-7860K APU launch is accompanied by the 7890K, a high-end APU at $160-ish that we'll be reviewing separately and in the near future. The 7860K runs a 65-watt thermal package while retaining a 2-module, 4-core architecture, and all the specs are in the chart on the screen now. But the short of it is that the new $120 7860K APU runs 8 GPU cores with 512 streaming processors, the very same as the 7870K that we previously reviewed, and the new 7890K that just came out. The 7860K operates base at 3.6 GHz, but turbos to 4.0 GHz, and we've observed some thermal throttling issues, though AMD does believe that the lower thermal package should allow for longer turbo periods. The GPU clock is noticeably slower than the 7870K, which is now priced at $140, by the way, and the 7860K runs at 754 MHz with the 7870K at 866 MHz, and the 7890K is also at 866 MHz. So then, to the astute viewer, it would sound like the 7860K is pretty comparable to the previous 7870K and other AMD APUs, and that would be a correct assumption or viewpoint because the architecture is actually the same. It's just another refresh where they've done a few reductions to thermals and they've done reductions in clock speed to help with those thermals and to lower the price. It is $118 MSRP. 7870K is now $140, and the 7890K is around $160. Definitely a pretty steep price for an APU, but we'll look at that separately. We previously said that the 7870K would actually be a pretty good buy at around $120, which is what the 7860K is priced at now. And that statement was based on the fact that in our tests, we found that cheap CPUs with cheap DGPUs actually performed much better than a 7870K at maybe around $10 more than its $140, $150-ish price range. So today, with the 7860K at the $120 price point we asked for the 7870K, it's time to look at the clock rates and the thermal changes here and see if it impacts FPS to a point that it's not actually worth the buy, or is it actually a feasible solution for cheap computers now? Let's look at the gaming benchmarks and see if this thing is actually worthwhile. As always, check the article in the description below for full testing methodology in more depth. We'll first look at thermals briefly, and then we'll talk about gaming FPS. Our thermal testing methods were recently validated with the thermal chamber, and we found them to be nearly perfectly accurate. So for today's test, we decided to change things up a little bit. We used a stock cooler with each of the two APUs on bench rather than using an identical cooler for them. And so we're looking at the performance as boxed, meaning when you get the product with the cooler that is in the box, how does it actually perform comparatively between the 7870K and the 7860K with the smaller Cooler Master cooler versus the 7870K with the Wraith cooler. Equilibrium results show the Wraith to be a significantly more efficient cooler, no big surprise there, and even with the hotter TDP of the 7870K and the higher operating clock, we logged the 7860K with its stock cooler and thermal paste at 29.5 C delta T over ambient. The Wraith-cooled 7870K ran at 25.866 C delta T over ambient, and both are fairly and actually fully acceptable CPU temperatures for AMD especially, and these are impressive steps in the right direction. To be fair though, these APUs are quite a bit cooler than AMD's FX counterparts, and do note as well, this is very important, that we had to use T-case for CPU thermal measurements due to software issues with locating T-junction on APUs. Time for gaming benchmarks. The first up is GTA 5 on normal settings using only the IGP, so we've got no DGPU here. The two configurations which use a DGPU are running an El Cheapo card, the R7 250X, which plants those total configuration costs close to the high-end APUs. The A10-7860K lands only barely above 20 FPS here, making it effectively unplayable without support from discrete GPUs. To its credit, the new APU does outperform the i3-4160 marginally, and its HD series IGP, but neither lands anywhere remotely close to the realm of playability. GTA 5 isn't playable until adding a DGPU to the mix. Even a cheap, relatively poor performing 250X boosts FPS by more than 2x over these APUs, so definitely a statement there to the performance levels. Moving on to Grid Autosport at medium settings with 0-tap AA, we see the cheap DGPU plus cheap CPU combinations performing best, with the 7870K taking a strong first among IGPs and APUs, and the new 7860K performs slightly slower than the 7870K, actually a good amount slower, not just slightly. It is actually a 27.8% difference, and both are more or less able to handle the racing title with some more tuning, but the APUs and even some Intel IGPs need to be generally tuned slightly below medium settings for best playability at 1080p without a DGPU in Grid Autosport at medium settings. Dota 2 isn't particularly compelling either, which is a real shame because this is sort of the flagship mark for APUs and IGPs. With an FPS that's hardly any better than an i3-4160, the 7860K leaves us generally unimpressed, and actually the difference between the i3 and the 7860 is imperceptible to a real-world user. The 7860K really struggles here, and the gap between the 7860K and the 7870K corresponds with clock rate throttling that seems resultant of the hard 65-watt TDP constraint on the new APU. Next up, a few CPU-heavy charts that run a GTX 980 Ti DGPU to eliminate the GPU bottleneck as much as possible. So here we're looking more at CPU performance individually. Shadow of Mordor clearly throttles at around 97 FPS on this particular GPU, so hitting 80 FPS with a 7860K is admirable, but does show a clear bottleneck that is inferior to even an i3-4160. In this instance, if you're planning on pairing a DGPU with your cheap CPU, we'd actually strongly recommend an i3 over a comparably priced APU. Looking at Metro Last Light, the trend somewhat persists, though the i3 CPU does throttle the GPU pretty heavily here by around 30%. The 7860K is even worse, nearly a 50% throttle over the 100 FPS matched with the 4790K. Note that the 0.1% low frame times in the chart, these abysmal low results actually, are resultant of the thread count and really is a one-off instance with Metro Last Light. The game is very sensitive to thread count, and not every game reacts this way, as you saw with Mordor, which is much more forgiving with these metrics. Here's a look at Grid Autosport on the screen now on Ultra with 4-tap MSAA. As we mentioned in the article, we've seen a heavy favor toward Intel and Grid, so keep that in mind, and the A10-7860K nearly achieves parity with the 7870K in this instance, but clearly throttles the GPU massively. So is it worth it? Is the 7860K actually good for $120, where we said the 7870K should have been priced? Well, here's the thing. For $300 computers or ultra cheap systems, it is actually worth a look, because you're basically at that kind of budget, you're sort of throwing gaming out the window. It's something that you'd like to maybe do at lowest settings or medium settings if you can push it, but the system's purpose would be more for everyday use, browsing, just to kind of keep things going with a very slight gaming ability in the mix. And that's really about where the usability of the APU stops. After that point, it becomes a much better value to buy a cheap CPU like one of the Athlon X4s. They're actually really good CPUs, and pair it with a cheap GPU. Normally, we don't really recommend the cheap DGPUs, things less than $100, but if you're really on a restrictive budget, I would strongly recommend one of those with a cheap CPU over an APU at $120, especially $160, because once you're at $160, you're basically at the price of something like an 860K, which is a pretty strong performer, matched with something like an R7 250X or one of the more modern R7 340X cards or something like that. So that's sort of where I stand on those. Now there's one critical thing to note here, and that is the dark horse in the race. AMD's new Athlon X4 A80K was just announced, and that is a CPU-only solution. There's no IGP, and because it's got no IGP, that means that the CPU performance is actually pretty strong comparatively to the APUs, and it's got no actual IGP performance. It's got no graphics ability, so you do need a DGPU with this solution. The A80K is going to be $95. The 860K is already out there, has been out there, and basically succeeded the 760K, which we had in our charts here today. So if you're looking for a sort of cheap AMD CPU less than $100, I would recommend waiting on these APUs right now. wait for the A80K to start shipping to reviewers, take a look at its results, and ask yourself once you see these, is it worth buying a $95 CPU plus maybe, I don't know, an $80 to $100 GPU? And seeing how that goes, you're still at under $200 total for the CPU and GPU, still a pretty good cost. See how that goes versus these APUs. You might end up throwing an extra $20 or $40 at the solution, but for gamers, for the type of people I imagine are following this channel, I would generally suggest that approach with even a cheap CPU plus DGPU approach rather than the APU all-in-one type of thing, except in the instance of something like a $300 super cheap build where you are okay with accepting the life of low graphics settings, medium graphics settings, and just sort of dealing with it as a way to offset your low cost overall in the build. So those are the thoughts on the AMD A10-7860K APU. You can check the link in the description below for the full article. We've got the charts and everything there. If you like this kind of content, as always, subscribe, hit the Patreon link to help us out directly. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all next time.